Hi there, and welcome to today's daily encouragement from the Word. Today we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 1, and if you are one of my students and following along in your reading plan, Hebrews 1 is our reading for today. But a couple of things first, just to understand. One, the book of Hebrews, it's written primarily to Jews, and it was written to prove that Jesus is God and that he is the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. The author is unknown. Some people think it's the Apostle Paul, but ultimately no one really agrees. So they just call it the book of Hebrews, and they leave the author unknown. But one of the things that the author does is he starts off by showing that God spoke through the prophets in the Old Testament, but now speaks through Jesus Christ. That's verses 1 and 2. That everything belongs to Jesus Christ and was created by Jesus Christ. That's in verse 2. That Jesus was and is God. That's the first part of verse 3. That he holds the universe together by his power. That's also in verse 3. And that after dying for sin, that he sits at the right hand of God. And really, when you think about the right hand of God, in that culture, and really in a lot of cultures, in ancient cultures, the right hand is considered the place of power. So Jesus is sitting in the seat of power. And then lastly, in verse 4, we learn that Jesus Christ is superior to angels. In fact, I'm going to read you verses 1 through 4 of Hebrews 1. They say this: "Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs." Again, just this great, magnificent picture of who Jesus is as God. He, in his flesh, even in his flesh, was the exact imprint, the exact representation of God, because he is God. He has the power of God. He has the authority of God. And by that power, he holds all things together. He sustains everything in the universe. But then the writer of Hebrews in verses 5 to 14, he spends a bunch of time citing Old Testament passages. And the reason that he does this is because he's trying to show from the Old Testament that even in the Old Testament, it speaks of Jesus. It speaks of Jesus as God, and it speaks of Jesus as Messiah. So I'm going to read for you verse 5 of Hebrews 1. It says this: "For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'? Or again, 'I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son'?" This is a direct quotation from Psalm 2, verse 7, or verses 8 and 9 of Hebrews 1 say this: "But of the Son, he says, 'Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions." Again, this is another quotation from Psalm 45, verses 6 and 7. And then one of the other ones is in verse 13, where the author of Hebrews writes this. And he says, "And to which of the angels has he ever said, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet'?" Again, the right hand is the place of power. And that's not just something that God is speaking to David or through David, but what he is pointing to is he's pointing to this greater Messiah that would come. And that's from Psalm 110, verse 1. And again, David is the author of that psalm. Okay. So what are the takeaways? What are the takeaways from this? One, that we need to see that Jesus Christ, that he really is God, and that he is the promised Messiah of the Old Testament, that the whole Old Testament from beginning to end, and there are so many passages we could point to, that they are all fulfilled in and are pointing to Christ. And yet the Old Testament was written hundreds and hundreds of years before Christ, but yet again, it perfectly points to him. This means that we can trust the Bible, and ultimately we can trust Christ. Secondly, that if Jesus is God, if he holds everything together by his power, and if he is the one that created everything, then we also need to believe that he is in control. And we can and must put our hope in him, even in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. So, what are some things maybe that we can reflect on? Maybe some questions that we can think about to help us apply these Hebrews 1. And I came up with 3 questions for you today. First one is this. Can you think about or find any other Old Testament passages that talk about Jesus? This would be a great exercise for you to pursue, to look at the Old Testament, and you can even use Google for this to help you find passages like this. But what are the other passages in the Old Testament that point to Christ or give us a picture of Jesus coming in the future? So that's the first thing that you can do. 2, what's keeping you from putting your full trust and your full hope in Christ? If the Old Testament, which was written hundreds and hundreds of years before Christ, points to Christ and is fulfilled in Christ, right? That is a great, what we would call apologetic, that Jesus is real and he is who he says he is. And so maybe what in your life is keeping you from putting your full trust in him? And then lastly, if Jesus controls everything, how should we respond to this current crisis? How should we respond to the COVID-19 crisis? If Jesus is God, if he sits at the right hand of God and in the place of power, if he holds everything together by his power, how should we respond in this crisis? Should we respond in fear or in worry? Or should we respond in faith? So that's our encouragement from the word for today. If you watch this and God lays something on your heart, I encourage you to either send me a message, or if you're watching this on YouTube, put a comment and I would love to respond to it. But for now, I encourage you to stay safe, stay home, but above all else, trust God. Believe that Jesus is who he says that he is, and put your full hope and your full trust in him. God bless and have a great day.